The marble halls of Chicago's federal courthouse echoed with the sharp clicks of Sarah Mitchell's heels as she hurried through the morning security checkpoint. The early September sun streamed through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Her navy blazer, hastily thrown over a casual blouse, barely concealed the wrinkles from her dawn excursion into the city's south side. "Morning, Ms. Mitchell," called Jerry, the veteran security guard who'd manned the metal detector for 2 decades. He'd long since stopped asking to see her credentials, unlike some of his newer colleagues who still eyed her with suspicion despite her daily appearances. Sarah managed a quick wave while juggling her weathered leather briefcase and a stack of hastily organized files. The Martinez cartel case had consumed her life for the past 8 months, and today's early morning interview with a potential witness had been too crucial to miss. The teenage informant would only meet in his own neighborhood, before school, away from prying eyes that might mark him as a snitch. Her phone buzzed again, the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Sarah knew it would be Derek, her junior prosecutor, probably panicking about the afternoon's hearing. Fresh out of law school, he still carried the wide-eyed nervousness of someone who couldn't believe he'd landed a position with the U.S. Attorney's Office. She'd have to call him back once she got settled. The elevator ride to the 7th floor gave Sarah a moment to catch her breath. She used her reflection in the polished doors to straighten her collar and smooth back a few rebellious curls that had escaped her usually impeccable bun. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "You have to look twice as sharp to be taken half as seriously." After 10 years as a federal prosecutor, Sarah had learned to balance that maternal wisdom with the practical demands of her job. The courthouse was already coming alive, filling with the usual morning orchestra of voices, shuffling papers, and rolling court carts. Law clerks darted between offices clutching coffee cups like lifelines. Defense attorneys huddled with clients in corners, their whispered conversations adding to the ambient hum. Sarah navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging quick nods with familiar faces. She paused at the water fountain, using the brief moment to review her mental checklist. The witness statements were safely stored on her phone. Unorthodox, perhaps, but necessary after the pre-dawn meeting. Her suit jacket covered the casual attire she'd worn to put the nervous teenage witness at ease. The evidence files were. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she patted her briefcase. Yes, still there, along with the motion she'd stayed up until midnight perfecting. The heavy doors of Courtroom 7C loomed ahead, Judge Henderson's domain. Sarah had appeared before him dozens of times, but today felt different. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or perhaps the weight of the Martinez case pressing down on her shoulders. This case could make her career, or break it. One misstep with Henderson, known for his exacting standards and hair-trigger temper, could derail months of careful preparation. Sarah checked her watch. 40 minutes until the hearing. Enough time to review her notes and respond to Derek's increasingly desperate messages. She slipped into the gallery's front row, choosing the spot with good lighting. As she pulled out her phone to finally check those texts, she failed to notice Judge Henderson's steely gaze fixing upon her from his chamber's doorway. The day was about to take an unexpected turn. Judge Robert Henderson stood in his chamber doorway, jaw clenched at the sight before him. 23 years on the federal bench had cemented his reputation as a stickler for protocol, and what he witnessed in his courtroom this morning was anything but protocol. The woman in the gallery's front row, dressed more like she was headed to a casual Friday than a federal court proceeding, was absorbed in her phone, seemingly oblivious to the sanctity of her surroundings. He watched as she scrolled through her device, her casual posture a stark contrast to the formal environment he'd spent decades maintaining. The judge's morning had already started poorly. His clerk had misplaced a crucial briefing for the afternoon's hearing, and his favorite coffee shop had been unexpectedly closed. Now this. "Carol," he called to his longtime judicial assistant, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had become second nature. "Do you have today's appearance list? I don't recall seeing this defendant's case on the morning docket." Carol shuffled through her papers, adjusting her reading glasses. "I'm not seeing any women scheduled for initial appearances this morning, Your Honor." Just the Martinez-Cartel pretrial hearing at 11. The judge's frown deepened. An unscheduled appearance was even worse. Someone probably hoping to squeeze in without proper procedure. He'd seen it before. Defendants showing up on the wrong day, in the wrong courtroom, disrupting his carefully orchestrated schedule. The casual clothing suddenly made more sense. Probably another public defender's client who hadn't been properly instructed on courtroom etiquette. Through the doorway, he observed as the woman pulled a stack of papers from her briefcase, spreading them across the bench, usually reserved for attorneys. Her phone buzzed audibly, twice. And she continued typing, the soft clicks carrying across the nearly empty courtroom. Unacceptable, he muttered, straightening his robes. The morning calendar wouldn't start for another 30 minutes, but that was no excuse for turning his courtroom into a public office space. He'd seen a growing disregard for courtroom decorum over the years. Phones ringing during testimony, chewing gum during sentencing, even flip-flops at arraignments. Not in his courtroom. Not today. The bailiff, Tom, caught his eye from across the room. The veteran court officer had served with Henderson long enough to read his moods. Tom raised an eyebrow in silent question, ready to intervene if needed. The judge gave a subtle shake of his head. He would handle this personally. Henderson felt his blood pressure rising as the woman's phone buzzed yet again. She was young, probably early 30s, and her casual demeanor suggested she was either unaware of or unconcerned with proper courtroom behavior. He'd seen it too often lately. A general decay of professional standards, especially among younger people who treated federal court with the same casualness as a coffee shop. Your Honor, Carol's voice interrupted his thoughts. The U.S. Attorney's Office just called. They're requesting a brief sidebar before the Martinez hearing to discuss some sensitive witness information. Fine. He waved off the message, his attention fixed on the disruption in his courtroom. The Martinez case could wait. First, he needed to address this breach of protocol. It was time to remind everyone why his courtroom maintained the highest standards in the circuit. Judge Henderson squared his shoulders and stepped through his chamber doors. The sound of his heavy robes swishing against the polished floor announced his presence, but the woman didn't look up. That, he decided, would be her first lesson in federal court etiquette, and he intended to make it memorable. The gavel's sharp crack shattered the courtroom's morning quiet. Sarah's head snapped up from her phone, where she'd been typing urgent instructions to her team about the witness protection details. The sound of heavy robes rustling grew louder as Judge Henderson descended from the bench, his face set in granite determination. Young lady, his voice boomed across the nearly empty courtroom, each word dripping with decades of judicial authority. This is a federal courthouse, not a coffee shop or a public library. He stopped directly in front of her, towering over the wooden bench where she sat. Sarah began to rise, her mouth opening to explain, but Henderson's raised hand cut her off. The few people present in the courtroom, 2 law clerks, a court reporter reviewing notes, and a pair of early arriving attorneys, all froze, their attention locked on the unfolding scene. I have watched you for the past 10 minutes, Henderson continued, his voice rising with each word. Treating this courtroom like your personal office. The constant phone use, the inappropriate attire, the complete disregard for basic decorum. He gestured at her casual blouse visible beneath the blazer. This is the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, not a sidewalk bench. Sarah stood fully now, her spine straightening as she reached for her Justice Department credentials. Your Honor, if I could just. I'm not finished. Henderson cut her off again, his face reddening. I don't know which public defender failed to explain proper courtroom protocol to you, but showing up unscheduled, dressed inappropriately, and treating federal property like a public park is absolutely unacceptable. The double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A few more people trickled in, stopping short at the tension-filled scene before them. Sarah felt their eyes on her, a familiar sensation she dealt with throughout her career. But this time was different. This time, she was being dressed down like a misbehaving child in her own workplace. Your Honor, I need to inform you that. Sarah tried again, her voice calm but firm. What you need, Henderson interrupted, his finger jabbing the air for emphasis, is to leave this courtroom immediately and return when you're properly dressed and prepared to show appropriate respect for these proceedings. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to hold you in contempt. The threat of contempt charges hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Sarah's hands tightened around her badge holder, her knuckles whitening with the effort to maintain her composure. A lifetime of similar moments flashed through her mind. The security guards who directed her to defendant seating, the clients who'd mistaken her for a paralegal, the judges who'd asked to see her bar card while white colleagues walked past unchallenged. The court clerk, Angela, hurried toward them with a stack of papers, her face showing recognition of the unfolding disaster. But before she could reach them, Henderson delivered his final judgment. I'm giving you exactly 15 minutes to leave this building and return in appropriate attire. If you're not back by then, I'll issue a bench warrant. This isn't a shopping mall, young lady. This is a federal. The sound of Sarah's credentials slapping against the wooden bench cut through his tirade like a knife. The gold Justice Department badge caught the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows, throwing its official seal into sharp relief. No one in the courtroom breathed. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Judge Henderson's eyes moved from the Justice Department badge to Sarah's face, then back to the badge, his mouth slightly agape as the reality of his mistake began to sink in. But before he could process this revelation, the courtroom doors burst open with dramatic force. Federal Prosecutor Mitchell. Agent Torres's voice carried across the stunned courtroom. He strode in, clutching a thick manila envelope, his FBI badge visible on his belt. We've got the wiretap transcripts you requested for the Martinez hearing. The team worked through the night tow. He stopped short, reading the room's tension, his trained investigator's instincts immediately alerting him that something was terribly wrong. Sarah turned to face the judge, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Your Honor, as I was trying to explain, I'm Sarah Mitchell, lead prosecutor for the United States Attorney's Office. Those messages you observed me sending were urgent communications about witness protection in the Martinez cartel case. She paused, letting each word land with precision. The case scheduled in your courtroom in exactly 23 minutes. A drop of sweat rolled down Henderson's temple. The courtroom had filled considerably now, with lawyers, clerks, and courthouse staff gathering to witness the unfolding scene. Among them stood Derek, Sarah's junior prosecutor, clutching his trial notes with wide eyes. The casual attire you found so offensive, Sarah continued, her professional tone unwavering, was necessary for meeting a crucial witness in his neighborhood at dawn. A 17-year-old who risks his life every time he cooperates with us. He wouldn't have spoken to me had I shown up in a formal suit. Agent Torres moved to stand beside Sarah, his presence adding weight to her words. The manila envelope in his hands, containing evidence that could dismantle one of Chicago's most dangerous drug operations, served as a tangible reminder of the serious work being conducted beneath the supposedly inappropriate attire. I was not aware, Henderson managed, his voice having lost all its previous thunder. The judge's face had transformed from crimson anger to ashen realization in the span of seconds. His eyes darted to the gathered crowd, understanding that his actions would be the subject of courthouse conversation for months to come. The court clerk, Angela, finally reached them with her stack of papers. Ms. Mitchell, here are the sealed warrants you requested, she said pointedly, loud enough for everyone to hear. And Judge Henderson, the U.S. Attorney's Office has been trying to reach you about an urgent matter regarding witness protection in the Martinez case. Sarah accepted the warrants with a nod, her movements deliberate and composed. She gathered her belongings from the bench, arranging them with methodical precision. The badge remained where she placed it, a silent rebuke to assumptions and prejudices. If you'll excuse me, Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtroom. I need to review these warrants before our hearing. Unless, of course, you still believe I should leave the building to change." The question hung in the air like a sword. Judge Henderson, a man who had commanded federal courtrooms for over 2 decades, found himself at a loss for words. For the first time in his career, the weight of his robes felt almost unbearable. The Martinez cartel case file sat unopened on his bench above, waiting for a hearing that would now proceed in a courtroom forever changed by the last 5 minutes. Judge Henderson retreated to his chambers like a man walking through quicksand, each step weighted with the gravity of his mistake. Behind him, the whispers had already begun, spreading through the courthouse corridors like wildfire. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle, the familiar brass suddenly feeling foreign beneath his fingers. In the courtroom, Sarah maintained her composure as she conferred with Agent Torres and Derek about the witness protection details. But beneath her professional exterior, a storm of emotions churned. This wasn't her first experience with prejudice in the justice system, but it was perhaps the most public, the most blatant, and ironically, might prove to be the most consequential. "Ms. Mitchell," Derek whispered, his voice thick with concern and anger on her behalf, "we could request another judge for the Martinez hearing, given what just happened." "No," Sarah cut him off firmly, though not unkindly. "We proceed as planned. This case is too important to risk any delays or complications." She straightened the files on the prosecution's table, her movements precise and controlled. The cartel's lawyers would love nothing more than to exploit any hint of internal discord. From his chambers, Henderson paced, his robes swishing with each turn. Through the window in his door, he could see the courtroom settling into its normal rhythm, but nothing felt normal anymore. His clerk, Carol, stood quietly in the corner, holding a fresh cup of coffee she knew he wouldn't touch. 23 years, he muttered, more to himself than to Carol. 23 years on this bench, and I've never. His voice trailed off as he caught his reflection in the window. An old white man in black robes who'd just publicly demonstrated exactly why the justice system still had so far to go. Back in the courtroom, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her mother. "How's the big case going today, baby?" She stared at the text, wondering how to even begin explaining what had just transpired. Her mother had warned her about days like this, had prepared her for them since childhood, but knowing they would come didn't make them any easier to navigate. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The Martinez hearing would begin in less than 15 minutes, and both Sarah and Judge Henderson knew they would have to face each other again, this time with a full courtroom watching their every interaction. Agent Torres touched Sarah's elbow gently. "The witness's family has been moved to the safe house," he reported quietly, "but he's asking to speak with you again. Says he only trusts you to handle this right." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of that trust. It had taken months to build rapport with the teenage witness, to convince him that this white-dominated system could actually deliver justice for his community. Now she couldn't help but wonder what he would think if he had witnessed today's scene. A soft knock on the courtroom doors drew everyone's attention. Judge Henderson's clerk emerged from his chambers, her face solemn. "Ms. Mitchell," she called out, her voice carrying in the hushed room. "Judge Henderson would like a word before the hearing begins." She paused, then added, "If you're willing." All eyes turned to Sarah. In that moment, she knew her response would set the tone not just for the upcoming hearing, but for every future interaction in this courthouse. She gathered her files, squared her shoulders, and made a decision that would alter more than just one judge's perspective. The Martinez hearing was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes when Judge Henderson emerged from his chambers, his robes pressed, but his usual commanding presence notably subdued. The courtroom had filled to capacity, word of the earlier confrontation having drawn an unusually large crowd of attorneys, clerks, and courthouse staff, all pretending to be absorbed in their phones or paperwork. Sarah sat at the prosecution's table, reviewing documents with Derek, her back straight and her movements deliberate. She had chosen to meet with the judge briefly in his chambers, a 5-minute conversation that had left Henderson looking shaken and Sarah even more resolved. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. As the assembled crowd stood, Henderson didn't immediately take his seat as he usually did. Instead, he remained standing, his hands gripping the bench before him. "Before we proceed with the Martinez hearing," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his years on the bench, but stripped of its usual authority, "I need to address what occurred in this courtroom approximately 40 minutes ago." He paused, looking directly at Sarah for the first time since his chambers. "I made assumptions today that were not only incorrect but spoke to a deeper problem within our justice system, a problem that I, as a federal judge, am supposed to help solve, not perpetuate." His words fell into complete silence. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased. Derek glanced at Sarah, who kept her eyes forward, her expression professional but unreadable. In the gallery, Agent Torres sat forward, his attention fixed on the unprecedented scene unfolding before him. "I publicly demeaned and threatened Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Mitchell based on nothing more than her appearance and my own biased assumptions." Henderson's voice cracked slightly. "In doing so, I failed not only Ms. Mitchell but the principles of justice I swore to uphold." A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several of the older attorneys exchanged glances. In all their years of practice, they'd never heard a federal judge make such a public admission of wrongdoing. Ms. Mitchell was performing her duties as a federal prosecutor with dedication and diligence, working since dawn to protect a vulnerable witness in a crucial case. While I was concerning myself with her attire, she was literally saving lives. He paused, removing his reading glasses and looking directly at the assembled crowd. "This incident will be recorded in today's court record, and I am self-reporting to the Judicial Conduct Committee. But an administrative record isn't enough. Real change requires public accountability." Sarah felt the eyes of every young lawyer in the room on her, especially the women of color, for whom her presence in this courtroom had already been a source of hope and inspiration. "Ms. Mitchell," Henderson continued, turning to face her directly, "I offer you my unreserved apology. Your professionalism in the face of my conduct shows character that I failed to display. This courtroom is fortunate to have you serving in it, and I am." He paused, visibly collecting himself. "I am deeply sorry." The silence that followed felt electric. Sarah rose slowly from her seat, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you, Your Honor. I accept your apology." She gathered her files, ready to proceed. "And if it pleases the court, the United States is prepared to address the matter of witness protection in the Martinez case." Henderson nodded, a mix of relief and respect crossing his features. "Please proceed, Counselor." The business of justice resumed, but everyone present knew they had just witnessed something far more significant than a simple apology. They had seen the first crack in a wall that had stood for far too long. 3 days after the Martinez hearing, Sarah found herself back in Judge Henderson's chambers, though under very different circumstances. The judge's usual imposing desk had been cleared of its files, and 2 cups of coffee sat steaming on a small conference table by the window. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room's dark wood paneling. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet, Ms. Mitchell," Henderson said, his robes absent, wearing instead a simple dress shirt and tie. The formal barriers of the courtroom had been deliberately removed, creating a space for a different kind of conversation. Sarah nodded, taking the offered seat. "Your clerk mentioned you've been doing some reading." She gestured to the stack of books visible on a side table. Titles about racial bias in the justice system, several of them dog-eared and marked with yellow sticky notes. "Yes," Henderson admitted, running a hand through his gray hair. "Though I'm finding that reading about systemic bias and actually confronting it in oneself are very different things." He paused, stirring his coffee absently. "I keep thinking about how many times I might have done this before, without even realizing it." Sarah took a careful sip of her coffee before responding. "Would you like to hear about my first day as a federal prosecutor?" Without waiting for an answer, she continued, "I was stopped 3 times before I made it to my office. Once by security, once by a clerk who thought I was lost, and once by a judge who assumed I was a defendant's family member. Henderson winced but remained silent, listening. The security guard demanded to see my credentials, even though I had my Justice Department badge displayed. The clerk helpfully tried to direct me to the public defender's office. And the judge. She met Henderson's eyes. The judge suggested I leave before my supposed family member's case made me cry. "How did you handle it?" Henderson asked quietly. "The same way I handled what happened in your courtroom. With dignity, professionalism, and the knowledge that every time I stand my ground, I make it a little easier for the next Sarah Mitchell who walks through these doors." She placed her coffee cup down. "But it's exhausting, Your Honor. It's exhausting to constantly prove you belong in rooms you're already qualified to be in." The judge stood and walked to his window, looking out over the city. "I've been on this bench for 23 years, he said, his voice heavy with realization. "How many careers have I impacted without even knowing it? How many talented lawyers have I discouraged with my maintaining of standards that were really just?" He trailed off. Prejudices dressed up as procedure. Sarah finished for him. He turned back to face her. "Yes. The fact that you're asking these questions now matters," Sarah said. "But what matters more is what you do with the answers." Henderson returned to his seat, pulling a legal pad from beside him. "That's actually why I asked you here today. I've been drafting some proposed changes to courtroom procedures, but I'd like your input." He slid the pad across the table. "Real change has to be systemic, not just personal." Sarah picked up the pad, scanning his neat handwriting. Her eyebrows raised slightly as she read. "These are substantial changes. They need to be," Henderson replied firmly. "The day in my courtroom wasn't just about my mistake. It was about a system that made that mistake possible, even probable." He leaned forward. "And I need your help to fix it." The late afternoon sun caught the gold Justice Department badge on Sarah's blazer as she began to read more carefully, ready to help transform a moment of confrontation into lasting change. 6 months later, the Chicago Federal Courthouse felt like a different place. Gone were the subtle but persistent assumptions that had once plagued its halls. In their place was a new awareness, sparked by one confrontation, but sustained by dedicated effort for change. Judge Henderson stood at a podium in the courthouse's main conference room, addressing a packed audience of judges, attorneys, and court staff. The quarterly diversity training session had been his initiative, but its success had exceeded even his expectations. Behind him, a slideshow displayed statistics from the newly implemented tracking system for bias complaints and resolutions. "When I began my career in law," Henderson spoke, his voice carrying the weight of experience and humility, "I believed justice was blind. What I failed to understand was that those of us administering it weren't." He paused, scanning the room. 6 months ago, I learned that lesson in the most public and humbling way possible. In the front row, Sarah Mitchell sat next to her teenage witness from the Martinez case, now a high school graduate headed to college on a full scholarship, his testimony having helped dismantle one of Chicago's most dangerous drug operations. The witness protection program had worked, but more importantly, he'd seen firsthand that justice could work too. "The changes we've implemented aren't just procedural," Henderson continued. "They're fundamental. Every person who enters this courthouse, whether they're a federal prosecutor or a first-time defendant, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Our new protocols aren't about being politically correct, they're about being correctly judicial." The initiatives have been comprehensive. Mandatory bias training for all court personnel, anonymous reporting systems for discriminatory incidents, mentorship programs for minority law students, and regular community outreach sessions. But perhaps most significantly, there was a new willingness to acknowledge and address mistakes openly. Sarah's phone buzzed quietly, a message from Derek, now leading his first major prosecution. "Just won my motion. Judge Henderson actually cited your case in his ruling about witness protection procedures." She smiled, remembering the nervous young prosecutor from 6 months ago. He'd grown into his role, just as the courthouse had grown into its new identity. After the session, Henderson approached Sarah as the room cleared. "The Bar Association wants me to speak at their national conference," he said, adjusting his glasses, "about institutional change and personal accountability." "I saw the outline you sent," Sarah replied, "particularly the part about how real authority comes from admitting our mistakes, not hiding them." Henderson nodded, then gestured to Sarah's former witness, now talking animatedly with a group of law students. "He's doing well." "He is," Sarah agreed. "Yesterday he told me he's considering law school after college. Said he wants to be part of the change." The judge smiled. "The system nearly lost you that day," he said quietly. "Instead, we gained a whole new generation of advocates." As they walked toward the exit, they passed the spot where their confrontation had occurred. The marble floors still gleamed, the wooden benches still stood in perfect rows, but something fundamental had shifted. The courthouse wasn't just a place where justice was dispensed. It had become a place where justice was actively practiced, examined, and improved. Sarah paused at the security checkpoint, exchanging greetings with the guards who now knew every prosecutor by name. Through the tall windows, the Chicago sunset painted the sky in shades of possibility. Sometimes, she reflected, the biggest changes came not from grand gestures but from simple moments of truth. Moments when people chose to face their biases head-on and do the hard work of becoming better. Behind her, Judge Henderson's voice carried from the conference room, still answering questions, still working to transform one mistake into 1,000 opportunities for change.